This is ego-utilitarianism. This video is going to be a critique on the self-ownership argument, primarily introduced by Hoppe and adopted by the Austrian school, or at least most of the figureheads of the Austrian school, most of the quote-unquote scholars. Okay, so praxeology, argumentation ethics, and the argument for self-ownership provides the basis of all property and rights theory of the Austrian school, at least their philosophy, not necessarily their economics, which is also suspect. It is considered to be proper application of praxeology by most of their scholars. So here's a quote by Rothbard, kind of giving an idea of what it means to own oneself. The right of self-ownership asserts the absolute right of property in exchange. Each man, by virtue of his or her being a human being, to own his or her own body, that is to control the body free of coercive interference. Rothbard. So again, if you own ownership means that you're free from coercion of other humans. Just by being a human, you own yourself, right? This whole idea of rights is ambiguous and poorly defined. Okay, so we have an idea that self-ownership means to be free of coercion from other humans. So obviously we're not talking about merely owning one's mind, right? Because if it were that simple, then enslaving someone doesn't necessarily violate self-ownership, right? So we're not talking about the mind here, which some people will try to argue for. Like, everyone by default owns their mind because no one can violate it, but it certainly can be violated by putting a bullet in your brain, right? Or inducing some psychedelic experience by forcing you to take certain mind-altering drugs or something to that effect. But even your mind is susceptible for coercion, right? The mere fact an individual argues, so this is from Hoppe's The Ultimate Justification of Private Property Ethic, right? So the mere fact that an individual argues presupposes that he owns himself and he has the right to his own life and property. This provides a basis for libertarian theory, radically different from both natural rights theory and utilitarianism. So he's claiming that it's some sort of proof here. It's not even, it doesn't even fall under natural rights. And so he says self-ownership is something he's proven, right? And he somewhat implicitly criticizes utilitarianism, which is somewhat correct, and actually more correct than any of his arguments, any of his original arguments at least. Now, taking these two quotes together, right, Rothbard's and Hoppe's, obviously one can argue and be coerced. I can give an example of this. One can definitely be coerced into arguing. So you see here, just these two counterexamples show that, like, you can argue with this. I mean, you can argue with it and not own yourself. So ownership isn't necessarily a precondition or a necessary precondition to arguing, nor is arguing a sufficient condition to show that one owns himself, right? The same way of putting it. So as far as rights are concerned, let's go back to the idea of rights. Ego-utilitarianism says that all concepts exist by default, but instances of the concept don't, right? That's a difference. Ego-utilitarianism says that instances of rights either do not exist or the concept itself does not provide any useful information or have any significance positively or normatively if the ability to enforce them does not follow, meaning any privilege must be provided by someone or something. Ego-utilitarianism also says that for something to be personal property, it must be made exclusive to the owner, the exclusion principle. I have a video on this. There is no magical right in one's mind to one's mind, body, or other property. One must satisfy the cost of exclusion unless it is profitable for the cumulative interests of society or any other meta-self with the ability to provide these privileges, then they will not be provided, or at least they should not be provided, and at the very least, not sustainably provided, right? Meta-self profitability is what measures rationality, practicality, sustainability, and most importantly, morality, since ego-utilitarians' definition set they are logically equivalent, right? So all of these things are the same thing in ego-utilitarianism's definition set. Once I've defined morality as what evolution selects for, and I've defined the meta-self, then we know that these necessarily follow rationality, practicality, sustainability. It is meta-self-interest that is truly universal, that applies to everything in the universe, not only humans. The meta-self-interest cost-benefit analysis, profit function, to be specific, right? So this can be applied to all acting things and even non-acting things in an abstract way. So ego-utilitarianism says if you want to claim a natural right exists, you must show why someone will provide them. In other words, you must show why natural rights are meta-self profitable in all instances, not just for the one receiving it, but for the one providing them, more importantly. This is an impossible task, as I always can provide a situation where they shouldn't be provided. In other words, where it's not profitable to do so. To all people, to all the people that believe in rights, can someone show me an instance of a right, or a privilege in this case, in reality, without someone or something providing it? Okay, so think about that one. And if you have an argument or you have an example you can show me, put it in the comments below. Rights are an idea inculcated into us by the state and religion. We must learn to apply analysis without this confounding, useless idea. Makes no sense. Assumption criticisms about the argument for self-ownership. Austrians, and what I mean by Austrian, I mean the people that adopt it, and Hoppe in particular, who's created it, or who's quote-unquote discovered it in ego-utilitarian's perspective, have taken too many liberties with the assumptions, with this self-ownership argument. If you want to maximize logical consistency, you must minimize assumptions. I believe what Hoppe has done here has maximized the assumptions necessary to quote-unquote deduce the non-aggression principle. So it seems like he's emotionally set out to prove this, just like Stefan Molyneux with UPB. When someone, which is a ripoff of this argument, when someone argues, it can only be assumed that he has the ability to argue. This is the only thing you can say as far as necessary conditions are concerned. Not necessarily that he owns himself free from coercion. A personal slave can be given the permission to argue, as I said before. So one can argue without owning themselves. It is also argued by those in the Austrian school that when one argues, he's also respecting the rights of the people he's arguing with, right? Or he's presenting the argument with. The only thing he's respecting at the moment is the other person's or participant's opinion at the moment. Either he wants to convince the other participants on that particular topic, or wants to challenge his own ideas using another perspective from the other participants. It does not necessarily mean he respects all the property rights of anyone taking the other side, or everyone in this instance taking the other side of the argument, or able to listen to the argument. Again, one can argue with one's personal slave. Also, a person begging for their life at gunpoint is also making an argument without being free from coercion, not owning oneself at that moment, at the point of a gun. One cannot make a convincing case that the rights of the person arguing for their life is being respected at all, especially if he should lose that argument and the trigger were pulled. So going back to the actual argument, right? So here's Hoppe's quote-unquote proof of self-ownership from his perspective. Here's the logical form, right? So he makes a conjecture A. I just call it conjecture A. It is impossible. So it's a statement. Or an argument, a claim. It is impossible to argue against, deny the statement, you own yourself, right? So it's a complex statement because it contains a statement cell. So it's impossible to argue against or deny the statement, you own yourself. And you know what? On some simplistic level, I agree, and let me show why. So here's the proof. Assumption 1: in order to be able to argue, you must own yourself. Alternatively, self-ownership is a necessary condition for argument. So what that means is that if you don't own yourself, you can't argue. Okay, so therefore the contrapositive or the equivalent statement is that if you don't own yourself, you cannot argue, right? So that's the contrapositive. So it's a logically equivalent statement, right? Same statement. It's another way to put it. So the contrapositive is that if you don't own yourself, you cannot argue. Okay, if not necessary condition, then not the premise. So therefore, when anyone tries to argue or claim the negation of A, right, the negation of this statement, it is impossible to argue, which means you can argue against you don't own yourself. So therefore, when anyone tries to argue or claim the negation of A, then the person arguing has committed a performative contradiction. In other words, the arguer has shown that he can argue, and therefore he owns himself, which contradicts his argument and proving the opposite of his argument. This is equivalent to proof by contradiction. It is proof by contradiction, right? So it follows this form. And you can see here, he's deduced a contradiction. You own yourself and you don't own yourself, which is since P and not P, right? And then so therefore your assumption that you can argue it, you're arguing with it, is proven false. So it's proof by contradiction. And here's the major logical criticism, right? Well, there's actually two of them. Here's one of them. Hoppe believes he has proven a very significant point that Austrian praxeology builds upon in their property rights theory. Hoppe believes he has proven the statement, everyone owns themselves. But in fact, Hoppe proves a very trivial fact. He has only shown you cannot argue. This is important, argue against one's own self-ownership, right? You cannot argue against one's own self-ownership, assuming self-ownership is a necessary condition for arguing. Even if I were to just blindly accept this, which is still dubious, right? As I've shown, one must take great care to distinguish between these two statements, right? This one, everyone owns themselves, and you cannot argue against one's own self-ownership. Stupid people tend to conflate. Very smart people make fine distinctions, right? And there's a fine distinction here grammatically. I mean, and logically, let me say, not even grammatically, logically, there's a very big difference in these two statements. The statement you own yourself is equivalent to everyone owns themselves, as this is directed to all humanity, all humans, past, present, and future, using Hoppe's own idea of universality, right? It is unreasonable to assume that the statement is only directed at the people who don't own themselves and that can argue, which leads to my point. The statement, you cannot argue against self-ownership, is true if you assume self-ownership is a necessary condition for arguing. And even this assumption is proven false with the counterexamples I have presented earlier, like a person arguing for his life at gunpoint. But it is not simply because everyone owns themselves, which Hoppe believes. There is a second possibility that Hoppe's argument has failed to consider, right? And so I point to, so as far as the present's concerned, there's something called contemporary slavery. I haven't read this whole article, but this article claims that 21 million to 29 million are technically slaves. And I don't know their definition of slavery, but I'm sure it has to do with coercion. Including taxpayers, we're all kind of being coerced through taxation. So Hoppe's argument falls flat on its face because it does not consider the proportion of the population who don't own themselves. This segment of the population by default cannot argue by the assumption. Hoppe's argumentation ethics is like saying to you are not, is like saying Hoppe's argumentation ethics is like saying you are not turtles to all the turtles in the world. So imagine me making the claim you are not turtles to all the turtles. So I'm directing this to all turtles because they lack the ability to argue, you know, the ability to comprehend what I'm saying, the ability to formulate an argument against it, and maybe even the ability to speak or write it or convey it to me. Because they lack this ability to argue, and by default, then then by default the turtles cannot argue with the claim. But clearly that does not prove my patently false statement that I've made to them, because obviously they are, by definition, they are turtles by my hypothetical, right? So, but clearly that doesn't prove the patently false claim that they are not turtles. Only the trivial claim that cannot be argued against by the turtles themselves. So just because the turtles cannot argue against my claim does not mean my claim is true. And this is one of the particular fallacies that Hoppe believes why his argument's valid. In other words, Hoppe's argument is only going to consider arguments from people who own themselves and can argue, and ignores the people who don't own themselves. Who don't own themselves, who cannot argue, even assuming self-ownership is a necessary condition to argue for or against it. At best, it only proves you can't argue against self-ownership. It does not prove everyone owns themselves, okay? That's one major logical criticism. Here's another logical criticism. One can successfully argue against self-ownership and the universal, all humans throughout time, application of non-aggression. When making the statement, you cannot argue against self-ownership, the actual intent of the claim is everyone owns themselves, and you can argue against this. Again, you can disprove this. In other words, if I set out to prove this false, I must prove the negation of the statement. So if I try to disprove the statement, I must prove its negation, which is logic, which is one logical method, which is explicitly there exists at least one person who doesn't own themselves, right? So this is the negation of that statement, and you can reference the form here, right? Negation of quantified statements, and I provided a link here where you can. This is logic. This is mathematical logic. And again, contemporary slavery. So, and that's my counterexample, right? Obviously, contemporary slavery exists. They don't own themselves. Therefore, not everyone owns themselves. It's obvious. One can surely argue that another person doesn't own themselves and avoid committing Hoppe's fallacious performative contradiction, right? So, someone that can argue can make an argument for someone else who can't do it because they don't own themselves. Just by pointing to slavery in the past, present, or future suffices to show this claim is patently false, as I've already done. If argumentation ethics were truly a valid proof, then self-ownership would not be an axiom. One could praxeologically, quote unquote, what they want to be mathematical logic, one could praxeologically or logically call this law or call this a law or theorem, right? So this self-ownership axiom, you know, if this were truly a valid proof, it would be called the actual law or theorem. Praxeology, and laws or theorems are derived from both axiom and definition only, right? Praxeology is not a rigorous way of using logic. It suffers the same weaknesses as most philosophy. Its language and definition are not well defined and unsuitable for logical analysis. And the rationalization isn't a valid form of logic, right? Using words and verbalizing an argument without presenting both sides of an argument, that's not rigorous logic. Rationalization without rigorous quantitative definition will suffer the same reasoning traps that communisms or flat earthers commit, right? So when one attempts to reason just using common sense, you're gonna get, this is where communism and pseudosciences like flat earthers, the belief of the earth is flat, come from. When you don't use quantitative definition, which is precise definition, all well-defined definition must be quantitative in nature in somewhat, like how NASA defines a planet, for instance. It's quantitative, right? What's big, what's fat, what's large, what's fast. All these are relative terms. When just using them in a connotative sense are ambiguous because they do not contain a critical quantifier, right? If I were to define fat as anything with a BMI over 25, then it necessarily becomes well defined, because you can apply this definition to any human, and it will, and well-defined definition acts like a function. It must map all objects in reality to either it must identify any object in reality as either part of the set or not part of the set, or part of its complement. And this is what a good definition does. And it must be quantitative in nature. You must have some quantitative qualifier in order to make it a valid function. And this is what Austrians don't realize. They want to ditch altogether the whole idea of quantifiers, and they think it's rigorous logic, which they call praxeology, and they're attempting to make mathematical. They're attempting to use mathematical logic to deduce economic principles from first assumptions. This is mathematical logic, and math requires quantitative definition, and they don't realize this. And when you do this, when you come up with definition sets that are not quantitative in nature, you're going to run into fallacy. You're going to be riddled with fallacy. And as I'm going to show in more of my videos, as far as the Austrian school and most of its original work, it's garbage. All the stuff that was derived from Mises and Rothbard, most of the original stuff, and even Hoppe, and Hoppe especially, all of their original contribution to economic and philosophical thought are garbage. Anyways, if you have any comments, criticisms, counterexamples, leave them in the comments below. I try to answer as many as I can. If you can, tag me. But thanks for watching my video.